We are happy to host our friend Chris Chu, maybe our frenemy since he keeps winning the inpatient teaching award. We'll say that. But Dr. Chu is a med-peds doctor who's in our GIM department and also the leader and director of their education and digital scholarship program. So he is here to talk to us about podcasting for the Hospitalist. And again, thanks for joining us. I'll let you take it away here.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So I guess today I'll be, in case you were mistaken about what I was talking about, but I'm talking about podcasts and the Hospitalist. This is sort of a combination of a couple of talks that I've given in the past, talking about podcasting. So there might be some parts that you might recognize if you came to my grand rounds from our internal medicine grand rounds about a year or so ago. But there are also some areas which we'll go through. So this is me, but I guess we don't need to dwell on this slide anymore than that. I do have some disclosures, so not really like sort of conflicts of interest, but I am a producer on the Curbsiders, and I'm on several other episodes. And about a year ago, I co-founded the Curbsiders, which is our pediatric medicine podcast. So since I'll be talking about podcasting, just wanted you guys to know about that. So our agenda today. First, we're going to talk about, for those who are uninitiated and don't know what podcasting is, we'll sort of talk about like the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, whys of podcasting, and so that we have sort of a shared mental model. And then we'll talk about sort of how podcasts have evolved and sort of the innovations that are involved in terms of medical education and how people sort of view podcasts. Next, it's not all like unicorns and rainbows. There are challenges to podcasts. There definitely are concerns about widespread adoption of podcasts into, our traditional curricula, whether it's in med school or residency. And we'll sort of talk about some of those challenges, the barriers, and maybe some of the opportunities that are there. Next is sort of an area that I sort of added to this talk because of the number of questions that I often get, is a little behind the scenes. So what does it take to make a podcast, at least the way we do it in the episodes that I produce. And then maybe what your role is in podcasting, not necessarily creating podcasts, but maybe in the curation of them. And last, we'll have a quick Q&A afterwards in case you had any other questions about podcasting. So really can't talk about podcasting or these types of what we call digital scholarship without talking about free open access medical education. It's also known as the acronym FOAM. And this acronym was coined back in 2012 over a pint of Guinness. I know the picture is not Guinness, so I apologize. But it was over a pint of Guinness in Dublin by Mike Cadigan, who was one of the early adopters of sort of this FOAM idea. So what is FOAM? FOAM is a collection of resources. It's a community and an ethos. And it really spontaneously emerged from the collection of constantly evolving, collaborative, interactive, open access medical education resources, things that you see online, just like, blogs, podcasts, tweets, YouTube, photographs, Facebook groups, all this stuff is considered FOAM because it's free and it's open, and it's really more of an ethos rather than like a specific platform, because it's really platform agnostic. And it's really, meant to be a crowdsourced educational adjunct. And it really was developed as an augment to traditional educational principles. So if you're interested in more, I'd be more than happy to talk about this. But so I just want people to have the understanding of what FOAM is and what podcasting sort of goes into this. So podcasting, if you don't know, Wikipedia calls as an episodic series of spoken word digital audio files that a user can download to a personal device for easy listening. Basically, I describe it to my mom like this is sort of just like radio that you can listen to with the TiVo. But, I would say when it comes to medical podcasts, it's not really like your traditional like Joe Rogan like podcast. It really is like, it's a high-powered educational tool. A lot of them are scripted. Some of them have interactive cases. They often have show notes that have easy reference or transcripts, a lot of citations and references, and a lot of them provide CME. So it's more than just like a regular run-of-the-mill podcast. So let's start with the first W, which is who. Who listens to our podcasts? We know from my own experience and our experiences working with the Curbsiders and Cribsiders that we have a vast array of people who listen to our podcasts. The Curbsiders actually have a newsletter, a weekly newsletter that we send out. In fact, we recently had a rebrand as we start adding some more things in the newsletter outside of just the podcast, but also, current medical literature. But when people sign up for the newsletter, they obviously give their demographics. So we did have a publication back in 2020, start looking at who our listenership is. And obviously, majority of our listenership is physicians, but more than just physicians, we have residents and fellows, a lot of APRNs, but we also get a fair share of students. Not on this wedge are actually some smaller amount of sort of pre-hospital people like EMTs. We have pharmacists who also listen, as well as nurses. For the Curbsiders, which we recently started about a year ago, we actually had a very similar breakdown. This is sort of early on from a couple of months ago. By the time we had 300 some subscribers, and you can see it's still a majority of physicians, but a good amount of attendings, residents, fellows, APPs, but other nurses and so forth. All right. So we went from the who. Now we're going to talk about when. When do people use podcasts? So to talk about when, we got to talk about background knowledge and foreground knowledge. When we're talking about background knowledge, it usually refers to general medical knowledge. This is the foundation which you build upon more advanced concepts. And these are from traditional sources, right? Textbooks and lectures, but podcasts are really sort of filling that role now because they may have core topics in medical knowledge, and learners can sort of curate these to their personal learning plans. So they can choose, I'm going to learn about hypertension today, or I'm going to learn about DKA today. But we also look at foreground knowledge, and this is sort of the knowledge that sort of is the type of specific knowledge that informs clinical decisions or actions. And oftentimes we consider foreground knowledge that just-in-time knowledge. These are the times when people usually go to UpToDate or Google or whatnot. But I have a patient with hyponatremia on my way to work. Maybe I'm going to pop in a 15-minute hyponatremia talk and get myself updated that way. Where? And I think this is probably one of the best parts about podcasting is where do people listen to podcasts? So convenience while doing mundane tasks. So allows learners to do it while cooking, making dinner, commuting to work, exercising, engaging in other activities. In an era where there's increasing demands on physician time, podcasts really give us a greater flexibility when compared to other learning opportunities. Learners have identified podcasts as the more efficient and enjoyable way to keep up to date. What's another type of where? So when we think about access to experts, and I'm thinking more like pre-COVID, because obviously right now we're doing a lot of grand rounds remotely, but a lot of times we have experts who are separated geographically. And so podcasting has allowed sort of a different where and allowing to bring the voice of these experts directly to your headphones. And lastly, the last type of where is sort of when I think about where, I think about learning environment. So podcasting allows people to learn in a low stress atmosphere. They can sit in the tub with their bubbles and listen to an episode about hyperlipidemia or something like that. It creates like a low stakes dialogue and engenders a real positive learning environment. So why? And I think this is a big reason for a lot of people. Why do people listen to podcasts? So in one study, 88%, this is one study of about 356 emergency medicine residents. They found that 88% of them listen to podcasts at least once a month. In another study of about 226 EM residents, they found that it was the most popular form of extracurricular education. And they found it the most beneficial learning method compared to textbooks, journals, and even Google. Lastly, users identified podcasts as an efficient, enjoyable way to keep up to date on current literature. So why? Why do people listen to podcasts? I think the first one is edutainment. Just like your favorite TV shows, whether it's a sitcom, reality TV show, crime drama, people listen every week because they want to see their favorite characters. And that's something that podcast listeners also identify with, whether it's a host or a recurring guest that you're familiar with. You sort of develop a relationship as you listen to them. For the Curbsiders, I may continue to listen because I like hearing Stuart Brigham or Hannah Abrams' like barrage of dad jokes. And, Marty on Core IM, he's got amazing dad jokes. So people listen because they like to have fun. They enjoy parts of the podcast. What's another reason? They want to stay up to date. We've sort of alluded to this multiple times, right? You know, keeping up to date is a great way. You know, they listen to podcasts to stay up to date. You know, they want to hear the newest studies, whether it's about diabetes or heart failure. They also may want to listen to an expert discuss the newest like hypertension guidelines. You know, podcasts really allow us to learn asynchronously. You know, they can do it on their own time. And as contrast to a lecture, you know, where there's a set place and time, you can do podcasting anytime. Community. This is the last reason why people listen to podcasts. So this is another forum where people can find a connection to fellow residents, other attendings, colleagues, the larger medical community. You know, it really helps people as they develop their sense of personal identity. All right, so we've talked about the 5 W's of podcasting. Let's talk a little bit about innovations. And to talk about innovations, I really want to talk about sort of how some podcasts are sort of constructed. And we have a couple different ways we can discuss this. So looking at one way, you can look at with content. So we have here like the Nocturnist versus Pete cases. You could have, you know, life in medicine, more narrative content, or you could have very specific content that caters more to core educational values. You could have no guests. So you may just have a host who is sort of having prepared the content, basically giving like a lecture. Or you can have lots of guests. You can have a rotating pool of guests, or you can have a large discussion. There could be a rigid presentation, or there could be a less rigid. There could be a fairly scripted presentation or a not so scripted presentation. I think when we're looking at innovations, I think it's caught on with a lot of people. I mean, ACP internists just from a couple of years ago were talking about how amazing podcasts were. You know, I like to group podcasts into several different innovations, and to talk about them, Dr. Shrey Trivedi and Adam Rodman sort of had a mental model about different types of innovations, and this is actually sort of how I like to group podcasts too. The first group I look at is the modeling, clinical reasoning, and diagnosis. These are the types of podcasts that take a skill that traditionally been really difficult to teach. And many actually honestly don't know how to teach it. You know, they take cases, often morning report style, and a listener can sort of walk through the important steps of clinical reasoning, develop their own diagnostic schemas or frameworks, and they're able to apply this to their future practice. Probably the most common one nowadays is CP solvers. You know, my friends Reza Manesh and Rabi Geha, who are proteges of the infamous Gurpreet Dhaliwal, you know, they do these virtual morning reports. They record them, they put them on YouTube as well as in podcast form. But I Am Reasoning is another podcast that I really love for this. Core M and Curbsiders have also had their own clinical reasoning episodes as well. The next group would be the multidisciplinary expert interviews. These are the types of podcasts that I'm part of. So Curbsiders and Curbsiders, you know, at the beginning of the show, my spiel is we are the pediatric medicine podcast. We interview leading experts in the fields to bring you clinical pearls, practice changing knowledge, and answer lingering questions about core topics in pediatric medicine. So that's what we do. We interview experts. So Curbsiders, Core IM, Bob Center's podcast, Annals on Call, also does this. Nationwide's Mike Patrick, who does PDCast CME, he also does this. So I think this is sort of another set of podcasts that I'm part of that I think is an important innovation. The next group would be the Navigating Medical Ethics and History. And these are the podcasts that really do deep dives into what has made medicine and our practice of medicine what is today. It shines that critical lens, usually in a historical perspective on why we do the things we do. Sometimes we do it because it doesn't actually make much sense. So from a history standpoint, Adam Rodman, one of my friends, does the bedside rounds. You know, he looks at things like what, you know, how, you know, the history of vaccines or how they've treated syphilis. The Curious Clinician, which is a newer podcast, you know, that's hosted by Avi Cooper over in our Palm Crit department, as well as friends Tony Abreu and Hannah Abrams. They sort of do deep dives into curious observations in the world of medicine. The next group is the expert discussion of recent clinical research. I consider these sort of like the Journal Club podcast. You know, they have hosts and experts, and they walk through their critical appraisal of literature. They break down studies into the biases and innovations. So examples of this would include Rounds Table, Freely Filter, which is the Neff Journal Club podcast. You know, here at OSU, Michael Pratt has the Ultrasound Gel podcast. Key Lime podcast, which has expert educators reviewing key literature in medical education, is another one of my favorite podcasts. Lastly, but not least, is the Narrative Medicine group. This is where like the stories, our stories as physicians and the stories of our life in medicine and those around us really help us form communities and form our philosophies of humanism, mentorship, self-identity. I think most people know the Nocturnist podcast. That's from Emily Silverman and her group. You know, they've called the Nocturnist sort of like the medical version of the Moth. You know, basically, you know, the recent series last year, Stories from the Pandemic, really helped us as a community know that others around us were scared and frustrated as we were confronting the COVID-19 pandemic at the beginning. Another series that they have is the Black Voices in Healthcare, which was executive produced by Dr. Kimberly Manning and adds more perspective and has enlightened me more about what it means to be Black and a medical professional. All right, so I talked a little bit about the W's of podcasting, a little bit about the innovations. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that are not so great. What are sort of the challenges and barriers we meet as we use podcasting in education? First, audience needs. Is the podcast episode truly helpful? Is it helping us keep up with the literature? Are we actually learning something from that? What's the optimal impact? Is the format correct? Is it too long? Is it too short? Do we need more banter? Do we need less banter? Are the guests correct? You know, production level, that's another one. Next is, what's the ideal role in medical education? Is it truly asynchronous? Should these podcasts be assigned? Should we allow our learners to sort of find them on their own? You know, what's the best way in using it in medical education? The last one is probably one of the biggest issue I get from most people. Is it peer reviewed? Some of our podcasts are peer reviewed. You know, back when the Curbsiders were part of the ACP and we did we did our CME through ACP, we had our episodes peer reviewed by a group of physicians over at Stanford. Core IM, when they used to do peer review before they joined ACP CME, they would actually they would pick another expert in the area, they would send them their script, and they would have a peer review that way. So that's just something to keep in mind. How have we sort of gone above and tried to help this? So here we have a group of podcasts, which we have sort of called the IM Podcast Research Collaboration. I don't know, we have a great name for it. But, you know, our group has been working hard to look at different ways which we can sort of research and review podcasts, figuring out the best way which we can integrate these types of learning into traditional learning. One thing that the EM group has done is back in 2012, the emergency medicine ACGME programs decided that there was a requirement that 20% of their didactic time may be spent on asynchronous learning. At the time, there was a lot more podcasts in the emergency medicine space. So they adopted a single resource called the ALIEM AIR series. So ALIEM is Academic Life in Emergency Medicine. And they put together sort of a database of approved instructional resources because they really watched their residents struggle to evaluate quality of their online resources. Using these modules, they were able to individualize their education, and they also gave their program directors some degree of oversight. We don't quite have anything like that in internal medicine, but it's something that I think many of us would love to have one of these days. So what do we do right now? So most of our internal medicine podcasts just try to at least get CME. So like I discussed before, ACP provides CME to quite a few podcasts in the internal medicine space. So Bedside Rounds, Core IM, Annals on Call. Recently, the Curbsiders and Cribsiders, as well as Cardio Nerds, Curious Clinicians, we all get CME through VCU Health. The reason why we switched to VCU Health is because ACP was great, but they only allowed CME through if you're an ACP member. Whereas VCU Health, they have allowed CE credit to anyone who signs up, and it's free. So that's nurses who need CE credit, that's family medicine docs who need CE credit. So one of the main reasons why we went to VCU Health. As we look at Kirkpatrick's model of evaluation, this is sort of the area where most of us are concentrating our research in podcasting right now. I think many of us understand we hit level 1. We get lots of feedback from our residents, from other attendings. What's their reaction? Do they enjoy the learning from podcasts? The next steps are, did learning transfer actually occur? Did this change behavior? Did the training influence performance? These are the things that we are focusing now to see how well podcasts are being integrated into medical education. I mean, our response has been pretty good. I mean, Cat Lover from Egypt said that our podcast was amazing, inspiring, and relevant. So I at least know that we're hitting the base level, but I think we still have a lot of work to do. I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what does podcasting entail, just because I get a lot of questions on this. Podcasts can take a long time to make. So there's some people, if you're a one-man band and you record by yourself, someone may be able to do the research, write a script, do their 15, 20 minutes, record it. If they do it in one take, then they're done. They add some music and they publish online. They could probably do that in a day. But when you get more complex, when you have a producer, multiple hosts, and a guest, and you make a script, then you have to record, then you have a lot of post-production, it can take several months. So, I have people ask me, how long does it take? So for me, for curbsiders, to produce an episode may take two or 3 months. So it may seem long and onerous, but it's what we do in order to make sure that we have good quality episodes. So how do we make the podcast? So, on the left here is our infographic that we made because we get the question asked so often. We actually made a whole episode about how to create a medical podcast. Unfortunately, this is almost out of date because this came out right before COVID-19, before people used Zoom routinely and other med conferencing. And since then, sort of the landscape has sort of changed. Still, we encourage people to have very specific equipment. We'd like people to have a microphone, but oftentimes just Apple headset with a extended microphone works pretty well. I've had a lot of guests. They borrow their kids' gaming headsets. Those work fine. But I think the important part is that we have lots of other software out there. So, for example, right on the bottom right of the screen is Squadcast. There are a bunch of other online software like Riverside FM, Zencaster. These are just like Zoom. So you create a meeting, and then you give that to your guest, and then everyone gets on. So however many guests you have, so Squadcast has a limit of 4, which is why we don't use Squadcast anymore. But basically everyone gets on, you hit record, and Squadcast will record local audio for every single member who is on the call. That way we have the highest quality audio. They're separate tracks, so if there needs to be editing, it can be done. So we have a sort of long process that we have our producers work when we talk to our guests to get them set up. Basically it starts with, we have an idea. We want to do an episode on DKA. Well, do we have any guests? Or we have a guest, people suggest to us, do we have a topic? After we figure out a topic and guest, then it's about an hour, usually a month or 2 as we develop a script with the guests because we want the guests to be as comfortable as possible. And then we record. What does a recording day look like? So you can sort of see here, this is what my typical screen looks like when on a recording night. So I'll have the script on the left side. You can see that we have lots of things that we have to fill out. The producer fills out as we script. We have our goals, our learning objectives, and these are all things that our guest is allowed to inform us on. We do this as a Google document, so it's able to be shared, and there could be comments that can be placed. It can be changed in real time. In fact, as we're recording, we'll often be changing the script or moving around questions or deleting questions. On the right-hand side, you can see we're using Squadcast because it's a 4 maximum meeting. And you can sort of see audio levels for each person, and we do a recording. Oftentimes, our episodes are about an hour long. So what happens after we record? We go into post-production process. So Back in the early days, I would do my own editing. So I would edit the audio. I'd spend a couple hours with my headphones and with Adobe Audition, and I would clean up everyone's tracks. I'd merge them all. I'd add music and all that stuff. These days, luckily, with some sponsorships or some grants, we've gotten a little money and we're able to pay off an editor. But what are other things that a producer does? So in post-production, one of our producers will develop show notes. Now, many different podcasts will go different ways. Some like show notes, some like transcripts. I think from a reference standpoint, show notes makes a lot of sense for our demographic, as well as citations, double checking facts. But in terms of post-production, also, as we produce the episode, not only does the show notes go up on our website, but we may develop infographics, which will be part of the show notes, but that also goes on our social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. But also, we may also have tutorials. So Becca here, who was our producer for our general infirmary care, not only did she develop the show notes and the infographics, but she also developed a tutorial that's on the right side. And we sort of produce those all fairly synchronously, or may step them off by a day or two in order to continue to get interest on the episode. How have we done? So the Cribsiders have been out for about a year, and at the time I pulled these statistics about a month ago, we had 250,000 downloads, and you can sort of see we have peaks and valleys. An episode comes out every 2 weeks, so you can sort of see in between times we sort of have some low-lying downloads. But overall, we average about almost 9,000 downloads per episode, and getting close to reaching 10,000 downloads per episode. And that puts us at 10% of all podcasts. And most recently, it ranked us around number 18 Apple Podcast United States in the medicine category. For the Curbsiders, our brother or sister podcast, they've been around for several years now. I think July 1st of last year, we peaked at over 800,000 downloads total in the month. And you can sort of see as our residents get towards the end of the year during the holiday season, it dips a little bit, comes back during the spring, and it dips again just as people start to graduate. But we always see a big boost when interns start. So that's a little bit behind the scenes, a little bit of the sauce, but not everyone's going to be a creator, and I understand this. And so the question is, where do you sort of come in as the hospitalist, as the educator there with students and residents? Early on in COVID-19, Dan Minter, Robbie Geha, Reza Manesh, and Gupri Dalirwal came up with a paper talking about future comes early to medical educators. And this gives us sort of like a paradigm of like stereotyped ways in which clinician educators can be adapted into using new digital tools. So first is the creator. So teaching has always been a creative endeavor. And, the authors here argue that social media is the new global classroom. So people who work on MedTwitter, like Avi Cooper, does tutorials. People who make podcasts make podcasts. But we also know not everyone can be a creator. The second role is a moderator. So not necessarily as well as Chris Wallace, I guess. I didn't make this slide, by the way. But, you can moderate a virtual morning report. That's a way people can moderate. But I think we as a group, in terms of podcasting, sort of lay in as a clinician educator, is the curator. So, clinical teachers have always served as intermediates between learners and their literature. If we all have one person who we can ask to remember that cardiology trial acronym. But, this is where we see my audience, the listeners here, sort of can engage in the podcasting world. You listen to an episode, you find something familiar. This is something that you can sort of steer your learners to a specific episode or a specific podcast. You found that the educational materials involved that was presented was of good quality, and then you are then bringing it to the learner. So in the end, I guess the big question is podcasting a fad or is it durable innovation? And hopefully during this discussion today, I've convinced at least some of you that maybe it's going to be a durable innovation, and that, some of these barriers that we have towards broad implementation and incorporation to traditional medical curricula, we're getting there. And I think that now we have multiple opportunities to learn about our learners and their learning. And hopefully we've empowered you to be able, as frontline clinician educators, to have the tools to become a podcast curator. So the bottom line is the difference between podcasts emerging as a durable innovation or disappearing as a fleeting fad really depends on you. So hopefully your adoption, your thoughtful criticism, and your willingness to try new strategies will help us. Special thanks to Marty Freed, who has done some other presentations with me on podcasting, social media, digital scholarship. We often call ourselves the Chris and Marty Show. Thanks to Justin Burke, who is my co-founder on the Curbsiders, and to Matt Watto, Paul Williams, and Stuart Brigham, who, had they not brought me on to the Curbsiders many years ago, my career would have been very different. On to Q&A.
Thank you, Chris. I can try to help. Looks like I got some questions here. Oh, that was a thank you, but I had some questions, so I'll start with my own. Just knowing again that you do really well with the resident reviews, and they really appreciate your inpatient teaching in person beyond what you put out onto podcast. I wanted to kind of know, how does your work with podcasting really influence your bedside teaching, your bedside rounds? Do you make things quicker? Do you just say, hey, just refer to my podcast and move on? Or how do you, how does that change how you round, or what makes you different?
That's a good question. I don't know if I would say the way my podcasting has informed my ability as a medical educator is the fact that I listen to a lot of podcasts, which also means that I feel like I am up to date on a lot of medical literature, whether it's listening to, literally finding new articles or hearing about the newest guidelines. And therefore, that makes me like an easy person to it makes me a super curator in that sort of sense. So, and I don't just, share my own podcasts. I mean, Core IM, I should probably share Core IM, Marty's podcast more than mine, because Core IM podcasts are, between 15 and 20 minutes long. So they're pretty short. Usually people can fit them in a commute. But oftentimes I share show notes. So on the Curbsiders, we have pretty extensive show notes for different things, and I'll just share, or even just infographics. And as I teach, I sort of do like the 1 minute preceptor type sort of model. We're presenting, and I'm like, okay, well, as we're talking about this one thing, what is, here's a pearl, and as we talk about the pearl, then I can give them references. Me personally, as an educator, one of the ways I share my references is actually I send a daily email to all my residents with all the topics that we've discussed. So as I'm rounding on my rounding sheet, I actually write down each topic that we discuss. And so at the end of the day, I just sort of round them all up. I place them in an email, I send them out to everyone so that they're able to review all the resources and references that we talked about. But so I don't think my podcasting necessarily has like made me a better teacher, but has helped me become like a super curator in that sense.
That's a good point. That's a good point also about sending like a recap at the end of the day so people can access what you talked about on your feet and in front of your computer. And so my next question would be, talk to me about what is the role of intellectual property of an OSU employed physician, or how you could potentially make money for what you've invested. Like, what does OSU own that you produce just by virtue of you being an employee here? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a very good question. IP is a touchy subject. Core IM and Core EM both went through issues because both were mostly based at NYU, and they went through a lot of intellectual property issues throughout their time. Luckily, Curbsiders is not owned by me. I am a volunteer producer for them, and so Curbsiders is incorporated, and so they own all their own IP. So me as a volunteer who's helping with them, I haven't run into any issues. Now, if I were to start getting money, this, like I said, all of this is volunteer right now, and the monies that we do get, like from the Curbsiders where we do advertising, that's all on the other end. They use their advertising revenue to pay for web hosting, for the newsletter, for editors and all that stuff. But by and large, the entire group of us who contribute, we're all volunteer. I would say, yeah, there are some tricky issues when it comes to IP. One of the reasons why, so the Curbsiders, we started, 6 years ago. A bunch of us were all in the Air Force at the time. And the reason why we developed Cash Like Hospital as the fictional hospital which we placed everything was the Air Force didn't allow us to actively say that we were from the Air Force. And we had to go through like also a rigmarole in order to get it approved. So we decided just to say we're not from anywhere. So that's sort of how that initially started. But yeah, IP is sort of a tricky subject. So I don't know if I answered that question super great, but definitely when you work for an institution, it can be difficult.
That's interesting. And then you also mentioned the roundup that emergency medicine had done and their own internal review of what podcasts they would approve and things for being good quality shows to listen to. Is there, on another aspect of that, is there a standardization for your metrics as far as promotion and tenure? Is there any way to say, you've reached this many downloads, this much national recognition? Is there anything standard out there yet?
I would say it's not necessarily standard, but definitely that sort of goes into the discussion of digital scholarship. And that's something that Marty and I present on at SGIM every year in our updates in SGI and digital scholarship session. Digital scholarship, which really I feel includes podcasting, but as well as social media presence, things like tutorials, blogs. This is an area that is of traditional scholarship that traditional scholarship has not really recognized much. Definitely, there are institutions that accept it more than others, and I think OSU is slowly becoming more accepting. I know people like Dave Stuckus over in Allergy Immunology over Nationwide. I think he got his, part of the strength of his P&T review was the work he's done on Twitter and his presence. But definitely, as I'm going through P&T right now, as I'm going up for associate professor, I'm on the clinician excellence track. So none of my 40-some podcasts and videos and so forth that I've done in the last year are really recognized as like traditional scholarship. So I sort of have to sort of skew the way in which I look at it and say this is sort of the way I sort of show clinical excellence. But I think there is room in the future, and there's a lot of argument. I can also share some articles on why you should be putting digital scholarship on your CV, because I think a lot of institutions are recognizing it and they're beginning to understand it more and more. But so in my P&T documents this year, what I had to sort of show is like what my reach is. So my reach included like how many downloads and things like, well, if we have 800,000 downloads, that puts us at top 1% of all podcasts, and then showing like how many, if you look at sort of reach that way, it's hard to compare to like, well, I have an article that's in New England Journal of Medicine. It's they're apples to oranges a little bit, but I think it gives people a little bit a better understanding of what those numbers mean.
Well, thank you. If you have time for one more question, there was
Yeah.
one dropped in the chat here about whether we can link to some of the more open access materials that are out there within our OSU OneSource, sort of like additional resources after someone has maybe accessed our clinical practice guidelines, or how do you think that could possibly mesh in the future?
Say that one more time. I don't know if I understand the question.
Karen, do you want me to ask it? Do you want me to ask it? Karen?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Chris, it's Allison Haycock. My question was, so we have our residents go multiple places for multiple learning tools. Yeah. And so I was wondering what you thought about would we ever come to a place where we could put podcast links with guidelines or with our teaching scripts that have already been approved, someplace that residents could get everything in one place? Because right now they're like, oh, okay, I want to learn about this topic. I'm going to go check the Curbsiders, or I'm going to go check here and see, instead of kind of getting everything in one place. Or do you think that would be too difficult because OSU doesn't own those podcasts? that was kind of my question.
Oh, no, I don't think there's any problem with linking them, just because, I would say they probably shouldn't be downloading them and like keeping them on their own database to be downloaded. But I mean, if you're linking to my Apple podcast RSS feed, it just makes me look better because I'll get more downloads. So
Yeah.
I don't think there's ever a problem with linking it. I think if you're going to put these on like, any public OSU site, it just depends on who's curating it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest issues, curation, which is what I think everyone here, if they listen to podcasts, hopefully can help us with, is trying to figure out the best way to curate and to understand like quality, whether it needs to be like one person is in charge of all the pulmonary podcasts and stuff, or one person is in charge of the cardiovascular stuff. I think that's the biggest issue, because also, things change. Guidelines are updated all the time. So yeah, I don't think there should be an issue in terms of like linking to those things, but I think the bigger question is who is curating that and who has the time to do that.
That makes good sense. Thanks.
Yeah.
Another question we have about your familiarity of gearing some of these podcasts towards the general public, and of course the burning question being something like information about coronavirus and something from a trusted doctor at a trusted reputable hospital. Is there anything you're familiar with that, or would you put together something like that with your buddies?
Can you say that one more time? I don't know if I quite.
The exact question is, what about gearing some of these podcasts towards the general public? Right now, it seems like your audience is medical professionals, but is there a role for some of the leaders of these podcasts to get together and perhaps put together some informational, such as like coronavirus or vaccine virus information for the general public audience?
No, I mean, definitely. I think that's more of an issue with when you develop a podcast. So just sort of like when you get a YouTube channel or you write a blog, you have to think about who your audience is. And so our current audience base, you can see who our listeners are. Not many people self-identified as a lay public. So I think that's an important thing to understand, why some of our podcasts don't necessarily, shoot for a lay public. But say if you go to Bedside Rounds, so Adam Robbins' Bedside Rounds, which is really just medical history, even though he does provide CME, I mean, his stuff is eminently listenable by anyone. I mean, he just talks about history and in a great way. So, I mean, there are different types of podcasts and I guarantee if you did a survey of his listenership, that probably more than half of his listeners are not medical. Now, I will say that, we do have podcasts that are geared in that way. So I talked about Dr. Michael Patrick, who does the PDcast CME podcast over at Nationwide. So actually, PDcast CME is his second podcast. His original podcast was PediaCast, which he still does, but that's his podcast he does for parents. So he's done PediaCast for, more than a decade, I think. And only recently, in the last half a decade, he's done PediaCast CME for just providers. I know the Cribsiders last year, right before school started, we did do a COVID back to school special to talk about the pros and cons, the policy of allowing kids back into school and what that means. So that was something that we published specifically because we knew that that listeners would listen to it, but also may share with parents who are concerned or friends. So I don't know how well it worked in terms of getting to the lay public on that, but that was something that we had intended as we developed that episode.
Right. I think any bit helps here in that realm. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you again, Chris Chu from GIM, MedPeds doctor, our next door neighbor at the hospital. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll send out the link with the recording once we have that all wrapped up.
Cool. Thanks for having me.